Welcome back, everyone, to OpenLine. Talking with Dr. Jonathan Metzl, Vanderbilt University professor, Dr. Ken MacLeish, also a professor at Vanderbilt. They have a new study out and a new article published in the American Journal of Public Health questioning whether mental illness is the wrong scapegoat for mass shootings. A lot of calls. Let's go straight to the phones. Lucy. Hello, Lucy.
Hey, y'all.
Hello. What's on your mind?
Well, I really do appreciate you having this show. I agree. I think mental illness is the wrong scapegoat, and there really shouldn't be any scapegoat. This is so multi-dimensional. We have come to a point in this country that we want everything one-dimensional. I've talked to people who've told me, well, the law should just be black and white. I'm like, that's why we have a Constitution. That's why we have the society that we have, because everybody is different. Everybody's circumstance is different. I think the main issue is histrionics. Every time there's an election, oh God, they're going to take our guns away. I'm of the generation that had to crawl under my desk because the nuclear bombs were coming and we had to drill all the time. When I go into an airport now and I see a guy with a machine gun, it really unnerves me. And I'm an adult. It just overwhelms me. I think that they're perpetuating this fear on kids more and more, and I think it's damaging them and making them afraid. As a kid, I had to walk through a valley of fire all the time, and I had to gain confidence. You know, it's like FDR said, the only thing to fear is fear itself. But we're teaching our kids to be hysterical, so we get more guns. They see more guns. I was up at the state capitol today, and I had a moment there where it scared me to think, how many people up here are armed? We're outdoors. What if somebody pulled a gun and started shooting? The guns would come out everywhere up on Capitol Hill, and it would be crazy.
All right, well, let's talk about all that. Lucy, I appreciate that.
All righty, that's all I wanted to say.
All right, thank you. All right, what do you think about what Lucy's saying there?
Well, so one thing that I think that it's really valuable that we can take from this is just a reminder of the fact that that mass shootings of the scale that we saw in Parkland, Florida, or even the kinds of events that the gunman standoff in Princeton, New Jersey earlier today, the school shooting in Maryland earlier today, these are not uncommon events, but they are, in the broader sense of gun violence and gun-related deaths, they are statistically rare events, especially on the scale of a shooting like Parkland or the Pulse nightclub or Newtown. And yet the fear that these kinds of events generates is pervasive, and it fills us with this sense of urgency, and it truly does, as the caller was saying, it truly does have a really powerful cultural force. And my training is in the discipline of anthropology, and this is what I study, is how our perception of seemingly straightforward problems, whether they're problems of policy or problems of medicine and diagnosis, are also part of history and the stories that we as a society tell to ourselves about what to be afraid of and what to take solace and comfort in.
And what you're seeing in these calls is that people are desperate to come up with some sort of solution. Mm-hmm. They are freaked out. Every time you see one of these things, it is horrifying. And it's there, but for the grace of God, that could be me or my kids or whatever. There is nothing, it seems, to stop these things.
Well, I completely agree with that. That what we're seeing is, I mean, what's horrifying about mass shootings, beside obviously just the loss of innocent life, is that these happen in places. That's why I was calling it terrorism before, because in a way these are places of sanctuary, right? Schools, movie theaters, factors like that. These are places where the last thing you should have to worry about is your own mortality, right? And so in a way, it's understandable. We as a society, across the political divide, are trying to create a better world, right? And so I think, that's part of the reason why we've been pushing back on this simplistic mental illness narrative, to say that actually I feel like when we just grasp at these simple solutions, as appealing as they might be, it takes us farther away from the bigger question of how can we create a safer society. I also wanted to thank Lucy. I thought that was actually a terrific call, a really honest call. school, this fear of walking past people in the airport with machine guns. On one hand, it might make us feel safe, but it also raises this specter of gun violence could happen at any moment. And I think that's particularly important right now because in Tennessee today, at the State House, they passed a bill that I think will go on the road toward this question of arming teachers, right? And I think that this question of arming teachers, on one hand, it might make us feel psychologically safer, but there's zero evidence. There's zero evidence. And so I really think we should be asking people like Lucy, children, parents, things like that, do you want to live in a society where your teachers are carrying a gun in school, or do you want to create a safer society where we don't have to worry about it in the first place?
Big discussion on Facebook as we stream this live. Pamela Page says self-control is seriously lacking compared to when I was growing up. Velvet Malujan says you can't shelter your children their whole life. I don't want to instill fear in my kids because one day they'll be on their own. Just lots of comments there on Facebook. Let's go to David. Hello, David.
Yes.
Go right ahead.
Yes. My name is David Metzl. I'm a veteran of the Vietnam War, and I don't understand. I'm considered mentally ill. And see, every time something happens, like the young man that killed 12 fellow students in Florida is considered mental illness, it upsets me because 99% of mentally ill people do not do things like that. And it upset me.
Right.
Because I'm sorry, I'm hearing in the background. Wait just a minute.
Well, I think we take your point. I mean, what do you think about what he's saying there?
Yeah, absolutely, and it's nice to hear from a military veteran in this context as well, because I think that one of the things that that the caller's comment reminds us of is the way that that there are a number of populations that are frequently looked to as potential scapegoats in the wake of violent shootings, often in ways that sort of multiply the stigmas that already confront those populations. And for instance, the recent really terrible and tragic shooting in Yountville, California at the Veteran Mental Health Services facility there. Even in relatively mainstream journalistic accounts in the New York Times and in the Washington Post, reporters from those outlets were describing the mental health services that were being offered at that facility, the mental health services that were being offered to veterans, as designed to prevent the kind of tragic event that took place there in the form of that shooting. And on the one hand, this is evidence of just how powerful this narrative is that links mental illness and violence, and also the narrative in our country that links military service and war experience with mental illness. But it's also just it's also an example of how incredibly damaging and stigmatizing that narrative can be, right? Because it furthers this sense that whether it's in the figure of a veteran who has served or been deployed to combat, or whether in the figure of a person who has been diagnosed with a moderate or a severe mental illness, that these are the people who we can look to scapegoat or to identify as the sources of these problems, rather than taking on the kind of full range of multifactorial drivers that we know are potentially at work here.
It's interesting. Yeah, I hadn't considered it from this point of view before. What sort of reaction have you gotten to this article, and when you're on all of the shows that you've been on, aside from ours, and we're getting lots of calls, but you're on C-SPAN all over the place. This article, what sort of reaction are you getting that mental illness is the wrong scapegoat?
Well, I certainly think it's funny because I thought, and let me just make one quick point before I answer that question. I think it's an important question, but I just wanted to highlight that Ken has a great book called Making War at Fort Hood that came out a couple of years ago that talks about the specific meaning of trauma and firearms in the context of the military. So for people who want to hear a bit more about his take on the military aspect, I think it's important. I did think the caller made a very important point, which is one I try to make every time every time I do media, which is a lot these days, which is that across the board, people with mental illness are not the high-risk group, again, for shooting other people. But if you look at studies of who's getting shot by different communities, people with mental illness are high risk for getting shot, right? And so there's a stereotype, and then there's the real world where the opposite is happening. And the reason I say that is People with mental illness very often are more likely to get shot by the police because they are odd. Another point we haven't talked about a lot is that 2/3 of gun death in this country is gun suicide, people who are potentially depressed or on having substance problems or things like that, and that very rarely falls out of it. And so certainly this question of what we're trying to do with our work, with this article and other articles that we're writing, I'm writing a book about gun suicide in America right now, is to say we understand the power of these stereotypes, but it's important to push back on them, because if you look at the real world, sometimes these stereotypes take us farther away from the issue we all want, which is to make a safer society. So I think in a way what we're trying to do is we don't want to take anybody's gun away. What we want to do is say there's a common drive right now. We're just addressing it in a certain way, and can't we move forward?
All right, we're going to take a break. Hold on the line if you were there. Also keep bringing your comments on Facebook as we stream this live. We'll take a break. Be back right after this.